Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Early Childhood Chats podcast. Andy Roszak with you as always. And today, a very special guest joining us, Claire Lerner. Claire is an expert in childhood development and parenting and helping us think about ways to maybe control the uncontrollable from time to time. Claire, thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thrilled to be here, Andy.
So, Claire, talk a little bit about kind of your background, who you are, what you do, how you got involved in this early childhood field that we're in.
Well, how much time do you have? I will try and be succinct. It's not my strong suit. So I always knew that I wanted to work with kids and families. So when I went to school, I studied psychology, decided to get a social work degree because it was really important to me to look at children and families in their larger context, which is what we do in social work. And then, for the past 35 years, I've done so many things in this, childhood space. I think what's most meaningful, maybe to your audience, is that over the years, I realized that I could be most helpful to families in the very earliest stages of their parenting to head off some of the challenges I was experiencing later, right? With older kids, especially teenagers, when I would peel back the layers and get a really in-depth history, I started to realize that if the parent had gotten some support and some good guidance much earlier on, a lot of these challenges for them and their kids could have been prevented. So I'm a writer. I worked for 0 to 3 for 20 years, running their parenting education department. And what I do now is I spend my time in the trenches with families who come to see me when they're experiencing some kind of challenge that they want to solve. That could, be a sleep issue, a potty learning issue, tantrums, not cooperating, challenges, with behavior in school, sort of the full gamut of challenges that arise for many families in the early years. And we collaborate and I help them do the detective work to really figure out what is the root cause of this problem, not just sort of what's our behavioral strategy going to be, but how are we really going to understand the function, the meaning of this behavior, and therefore address the underlying issues at play. So that's what I'm doing with families. And then I also do a lot of preschool consultation where I'm in preschools and I'm part of the team and I'm helping staff and families figure out, again, what the root causes of the challenge that may arise in preschool. And in that setting, and I bring the team together, parents, teachers, administrators, to figure out how are we going to best meet this child's needs.
And I've got to think things have changed a lot over the last 20 some years. Certainly as a parent, it's been interesting. I guess you kind of have this perception that they're just little kids and they'll be perfect angels and they'll listen to daddy and mommy and and all of this kind of stuff. And now that I find myself with a 3 year old or a three-nager, as I think you told me once, uh, boy, it's amazing to think of how many times you get told no or they simply don't comply with what you're asking. And I got to tell you, the first couple times it caught me a little bit off guard and I wasn't really sure how to handle it. And I know drawing on my own experience, I know how my parents would have handled it. It was quite a bit different than I know that we're doing today. So, can you maybe reflect a little bit on how things have progressed and changed from, I guess, our childhood to kind of the theories and the thought and the leading practice that we're seeing today?
Sure. So yeah, things have changed dramatically, and I think there's so many variables. It could take us hours and days to, explore that. But I think the most significant factor in a sort of a seismic shift in parenting and child development is all of the brain science that's evolved over the past 20, 30 years, where there was all of this science about the fact that babies are incredibly thoughtful, feeling human beings. They're not, what we used to think of called tabula rasas, like these blank slates, and you just imposed yourself on them. If you wanted a kind kid, you made a kind kid. Like, as you're saying, that's not how it works, because what we've learned from the science is that children come into the world with their own biology, their own temperament, their own unique reactions to the world. Um, and also that they are very deeply affected by their experiences in the world. Even though they can't talk and maybe articulate it, they are very deeply impacted. And therefore, that led to a very intense focus on parenting, right? Because if babies, even in utero, are absorbing, stress and feelings and emotions, and already there's some sense of regulation going on, and then they're born, and starting from day one, the way they are, you know, comforted, responded to, or not responded to, we now know makes a big difference, right? It's no longer like nature or nurture, which is what the big debate was, 30 years ago. Now there is a robust body of research that shows that it's a constant interaction. The babies come into the world with their own unique wiring and processing system that makes them respond to the world differently. And how their experiences in the world impact how they evolve and develop, even their brain development, right? They're very, it's very malleable and plastic. There's so much brain development that's going on in the first, especially the first 3 years of life, and it's their experiences that shape their brain development. And so that led, understandably, to a huge shift in looking at the importance of parenting and finding ways to help parents understand what makes their babies tick, what they need to thrive, which is all phenomenal. The challenge is that it's sort of changed parenting into like a job with a lot of stress and pressure, because parents feel like every single interaction now has, the power to make or break their child, which is of course also not true. We make tons of mistakes, but the way I see it is that it's the course corrections that matter. You are going to make thousands, and I'm still making mistakes, and my kids are 31 and 34. What makes a perfect parent is pausing, taking a step back, trying to figure out what is my child trying to communicate to me, for example, with this challenging behavior, and what do they need from me to thrive. So I think writ large, that's really the driving force behind this, this what some people call the parenting industrial complex. I think the challenge is that then all these voices started to appear, telling parents what that right way was. And what we know is there is not one right way, because there is not one child. This is not a monolithic group. These are very individual human beings who may need very different things. And so that's caused a lot of confusion for families. And in my work and in my writing, what I'm trying to do is help parents do the detective work to really figure out who is my unique child. Like, yes, I'm trying the validation, but that just makes my child angrier when I say, I know you feel sad. So it might sound good in theory, but if it's not helping in practice, what we want is for parents to feel confident, to have the tools to say, okay, that's triggering for my child. He doesn't want to be told how he feels. So maybe instead what we're going to do is just be very calm and quiet and say, it's a tough moment. I'll be here to help you weather the storm. So I think, enough said. I could go on for hours, but I think that there's a lot more to say, of course, but I think that sort of summarizes it.
Well, it's always fascinating. And I love, reading the books and your newsletter, which is phenomenal, and listening to you because you really do bring it down with, concrete examples and things that people really are struggling with on a daily basis. Whereas some of the other stuff that you look at or read or listen to, it's very pie in the sky. And look, I'm all about we can give my child choice A and choice B, but the bottom line is if they're about to run out into a busy street and get hit by a car, like there is no choice A or choice B. Like I need to take some action as a parent, and there's certain severity things that we need to address right then and there, right? So, um, kind of having that balance of like when there's time and space, and I think is this a must do or a may do is an important distinction. I know you talk about that a bit as well. What have you seen kind of in this post-COVID era. You think about all the things that COVID disrupted, the routines, the schedules, the parents now working from home and being around all the time, maybe the loss of that socialization at your child care, your Head Start program. I got to imagine that that is just kind of shaken the industry a bit, and especially from your perspective, seeing a lot of challenging behaviors. I know we've seen a lot more acting out. We've seen a lot more kids that are not potty trained at 4, 5, 6 years old. We've seen biting and aggressive behavior. We've seen kind of, I don't know what the right term is, dysregulation, deregulation, unregulation. I got to imagine the last few years have kind of been a bit more challenging with all these behaviors and kind of all the society change that we've went through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's seismic, and I think it's going to take a very long time for us to kind of wrap our brains around and unpack the impact of what COVID brought to bear for families. So I think the first thing I would say is that I have incredible admiration and empathy for families who had very young children, especially um, during those really tough years, because it parents were so isolated. And again, everything I'm saying, of course, is writ large, all depending. There's so many variables. Like, did you have family support? Did you have people who could help you? Was your job understanding? Did you have a child who was chill and go with the flow and was happy to just play all day? Or do you have a kid who's a big reactor, right? And easily triggered into upset? Like, all of those variables shaped the parents' experience. But writ large, you had a group of people, many of whom had to keep working, even if it was at home, in order to keep their jobs. Any help they had, much of that disappeared. They either had caregivers who didn't want to be in the home, or they had parents, grandparents who they didn't want to potentially infect. And so there was isolation, there was tremendous stress. There were parents just trying to cope. So, kids in front of screens for hours and hours and hours a day, and parents really without the wherewithal, understandably, to do the really hard work, for example, of saying to a 2 or 3 year old, you know, it is your job to get dressed. I'll help you with that. The thing we would typically be doing to nurture a child's independence, right? We would be saying, it's time to get dressed. Here's your job. Here's my job. But in this realm, when a child started to hedge, right, as they might when they're 2 or 3, you're not the boss of me. This is the hill I'm going to die on. You want me to get dressed. I'm not getting dressed. This is how I'm going to gain power. Becomes a full-fledged power struggle. And ultimately, often parents just, as one dad said, take the parenting path of least resistance because they had to move on, right? They had to get back to work. And so they were dressing their kids, feeding their kids. I mean, when I say feeding, of course, everyone's feeding their children. I mean, like spoon feeding, or, the kid says, I don't want that. I want you to make pancakes. Where what we know in those situations, to your point, Andy, that one of the loving things we do with kids is when we say you can have oatmeal or eggs, and they're like, no, I want, pancakes. What's appropriate is to say, I get it. Pancakes are awesome. They're not a weekday food. We don't have time to make that. Here are your two options. Your two great choices are to choose one or not. That's up to you. And you move on. You stay calm. You stay regulated. You don't get into a power struggle. And ultimately, when parents stick to that and don't respond to the protests and just acknowledge that the child's not happy with the offerings you're offering them, most kids ultimately adapt. Once they realize the limit is being held, the parent's not yelling and screaming at them, they're just holding the limit. They do this, they're like, fine, I'll have the eggs. So it's sort of like, I'm going to take my pound of flesh, but because I'm sort of eating crow because I really wanted to sort of take you to the mat on this and really get you to make me those pancakes. But like, that's a vignette that is seems simple but is very powerful, because that's really what kids need, right? Is lots of choices within limits, not short order cooks, which ultimately gets parents very angry. And that's why my book is called Why is My Child in Charge? Because most families come to me by the time the child is just making all the decisions because the parent is having a hard time holding the limit lovingly and battles are ensuing, right? So now you have COVID and parents are like, they're like, fine. And they're just like making the pancakes because they just want to take everybody out of their misery. And again, it's totally understandable, but you see the patterns that develop then. You have kids who aren't regulated because it's the limit that scaffolds regulation. It's the limit that scaffolds the child's ability to adapt and accept they can't have what they want when they want it. So now they come to preschool and they can't be the line leader, or it's not the snack they want, or block area already has 4 kids and that's the limit and they have to choose another block area and they're melting down because it's not because they're bad kids. I mean, there's also no bad kids, but it's not because they're like spoiled or purposefully trying to create havoc. It's because they haven't had the opportunity to develop that muscle. So I think that's a lot of what we're seeing, right? Is like parents not having, the wherewithal to pursue the potty training or to set the clear limits or to implement a clear bedtime so kids are tired, they don't have the self-help skills, and also there was just a lot of stress. My guess is there was a lot of yelling, and if you don't do this, and a lot of threats, which all of us have done in it when we are in a stress moment. It's just that was 2 years of incredible
Right.
stress for many
Yeah.
families.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you see it all the time. It's sad. You go out to a dinner or a lunch or something. You always invariably sit next to that table with the family with 2 or 3 kids, and the mom's on the phone, the dad's on the phone. All the kids have got screens in front of them, and I mean, it kind of breaks my heart. I mean, I get it. I mean, it's certainly the path of least resistance, but you wonder, gosh, what is going to happen in 10, 20 years if this is what reality and what kind of these kids expect now. It seems like a total breakdown of communication. And of course, screens have their time and place, but you feel sad when you think it's every single meal that kids are getting put in front of screens and not being able to interact and have those kind of conversations, which I get it. This is hard. This is hard work, man. It's
Yeah.
way harder than people let on,
Well,
right?
think of it really at the root of almost every challenge a parent comes to see me for. There was a lack of a limit. There was a lack of a clear boundary to help the child learn to adapt, which ultimately creates peace in families. So now you have this advent of screens plus COVID. I really don't. I mean, I feel like I dodged a bullet with my kids being in their 30s and the whole advent of phones and screens and FaceTime and Instagram. Like they were all fully formed human beings before all that came into play. And I really, it is incredibly challenging because now this is like a whole nother huge area of limit setting that they're fighting, right?
Right.
Because now in order to really have healthy use of screens, it really requires parents to be very mindful about exposure and what they're going to allow their kids to be exposed to and how much time they're going to allow their kids. But there are huge fights and parents are worn down. And what happens is you often have a throwing up of the hands and a lot of rationalization, right?
Yeah.
Especially if educational, they're learning. And as you say, yes, I mean, computers are part of our lives. There is definitely a need and a space for that. But the the heroic amount of self-regulation it takes for a parent to now have this whole other realm of limit setting that they have to muscle the energy for is really, really hard. And then you have all of the outcomes of kids being overly involved in screens socially, emotionally. Like it's again, it's hard to really wrap our brains around. And just another major factor, used to be sleep and eating and school, the main things that parents had to set limits around and be mindful around. Now you have this whole other, issue that is so prevalent and so impactful.
For some of the clients that come to you, and like you said, everybody's kind of had this hard time setting limits. I would imagine that it's hard to go from like 0 to 100, right? So is there kind of a way to dip your toe in this water and maybe during calms of quote unquote calmness, you start kind of integrating some of these techniques, hey, like you mentioned, like, hey, we're going to run errands today. Would you like to go to the grocery store first or the post office first, or something that's kind of mundane, really doesn't make a major difference in our lives? But is that kind of how you would ease yourself into this, or is it just like, nope, we go full throttle and this is like the way it's changed? And I know each kid's going to
Yeah.
probably react differently, but I'm just curious on kind of how you usually advise people
Well,
on that.
so what I usually start with is just sort of the foundational mind shifts that set parents up to have the most success in being sort of this loving limit setter, right? What at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to do is help parents thread this sometimes seemingly very elusive needle of being that loving, connected, validating, gentle parent while also setting the clear limits and boundaries kids need to thrive. Because again, there is no peace and love in families when there are no clear limits and boundaries. It's chaos, it's children spiraling out of control. It's a lot of yelling and screaming and power struggles. That's what's detrimental to kids and families, not the limit. When I meet with a family and they tell me what they want their limits to be, they're all awesome. Some limits on screen time, bedtime routines, healthy versus snack foods. It all in theory is totally spot on. For parents, it's the implementation once the child starts to push back. So here are the key. I'm going to take you through the key mindsets, and then I'll play out a typical scenario. But what I usually do is, after we go through the mindsets, is I suggest they pick one pattern situation, like getting out the door in the morning. It's always a fight. They won't get dressed. We pick one issue to make a really solid plan that they feel they can implement to stay in charge in a loving way. And then we build on that. Because as you say, Andy, like in any given day, there might be 20, right? 20 events or situations where the parent has an expectation the child is obfuscating or not listening or not cooperating or melting down. And it's way too much to bite off. You have to kind of build some muscle for it. So here are the key mind shifts. One is that you want to start by saying to yourself, is this an appropriate expectation? Right? So let's just say we have a 4-year-old and we say this child is developmentally on track and is totally capable of getting herself dressed. She may not want to get herself dressed, and she may want to draw her parents into doing that for her, or again, just getting a lot of attention by refusing to do it and drawing attention away from the new baby brother. Who knows, right? So that's the first thing is it appropriate? If you've decided, yes, this is an appropriate expectation, then the next question I ask myself is, in this little situation, what do you control and not control? Right? Because you don't want to go down the rabbit hole of focusing on what you don't control, which is your child, right? They are human beings. You have no control over them, right? That's the most humbling thing nobody prepares you for when you're a parent.
Right.
What they say, what they do with their bodies, only they control. Like you can't mind meld with them and get them to agree to, put their plate in the sink or agree to motor themselves to the car or to get themselves dressed or to brush their teeth. Like those are all things only the child can decide to either do or not do with their bodies. The control we have as the parent is the situation. It's the limits and boundaries and support we offer that helps children manage and move through these expectations, right? So now let's go back to the situation with the 4-year-old getting dressed. So we say, yes, she's able to dress herself. We are not going to go down the rabbit hole of getting into an argument over whether she's going to get herself dressed or not. Because here's what happens, Andy. The parent finally like wrangles the clothes onto the kid. And what happens 2 seconds later? The child's disrobing because you can't make them keep their clothes on. So that's probably the most foundational mind shift is to stop trying to control your child and instead control the situation. And I will tell you what that looks like in a second. But as part of this mindset, I find it's very important for parents to say to themselves, I have a great kid having a difficult moment. Because if you think your child's being manipulative or bad or spoiled or trying to work your last nerve, it's going to put you in a very harsh negative state of mind that is going to lead more towards threats and harshness, which almost always escalates the situation. It gets the child's haunches up. You're in a big fight. We do not want to be fighting with our kids. We are parents, like evolution has it that kids have parents for a reason. We do know what's better, right? That's not being authoritarian. That is being a good parent. It's the way you do it that, again, is not permissive or authoritarian, but is authoritative, meaning now I have this 4-year-old. She should be able to get herself dressed. If I do it for her, I am promoting a dynamic. Like, why else would she stop doing this? Like, if she knows ultimately she's going to wear me down, why would she ever stop doing that? Not because she's manipulative, because she's strategic. She wants me to get her. There's nothing wrong with wanting your parent to dress you. They're going to want endless screen time, endless snacks, stay up all night. They're going to want a lot of things that they don't need and are not good for them. So now I'm saying to myself, my job is to help my child learn to take responsibility for getting herself dressed. And I need my time in the morning to do other things. So now I say to myself, I'm not going down the rabbit hole of trying to get her to agree to get dressed because then she's totally in charge. I'm waiting for her to cooperate, which means she's in charge, right? You see the genesis of that. So instead, what I do is I'm going to call her Jasmine. Here's the deal, Jasmine. It's your job to get dressed as a 4-year-old. I totally get that you don't like that and you really, really want mommy to get you dressed. And I totally understand that. But I can't get you dressed because I have other jobs to do. So here are your two great choices. If you want to go to school wearing the clothes you choose that you would like to go to school in, one option is for you to get yourself dressed. Option two is you choose not to, no problem. I will help you in the car. I will take you to school. I will have another set of clothing in the backpack for you. You can change anytime you like. Done. I know it sounds very distasteful, but remember, it's loving if you approach it lovingly. This is not fine. Go to school and look like a baby in your pajamas. There is no shaming. Shame, we haven't gotten to shame, but shame is something we are avoiding because for so many obvious reasons, but it just floods children with terrible feelings about themselves and it really impedes any kind of growth and it erodes their sense of self. This, I would say, is the most loving parenting response because, again, if you keep doing it for them, you can't be mad at them because you are teaching them that that behavior will get this response. I'm not saying it's easy, and almost always the first day the kid, is kicking and screaming. And then step two is, I know it's difficult. It was hard for you to make a decision. I get it. Now I'm going to be a helper. I'm going to move you into the car. We're not getting into another 20-minute argument about whether they're getting in the car. You're saying, I have a great kid having a difficult moment. They need me to be their rock and move through this. You pick them up, you get them into the car seat. Now, by the way, I've had so many stories of how this worked out for families. But often for many families at that point, the child's like, can I get dressed now? And I do at that moment say, yes, I can give you a few minutes and they're done because now the child knows that you mean it. A lot of times they get in the car and the child in the car will say, can I get dressed? And of course, this is not mean, harsh parenting. Of course, that's the whole goal is we need to scaffold it so they make the right choice. They understand no longer are we getting into a knockdown, drag out argument about this. If you want to be wearing the clothes you want to wear, you can choose to get dressed. If you choose not to, you're choosing to go in the car with your pajamas on. And I've also had kids who go into the classroom, they change immediately. The next day, when the parent says, Jasmine, remember the deal. There's the timer. We're leaving in 5 minutes. It's totally up to you. You're the decider. But the have to is we are getting in the car in 5 minutes. That's the have to. Your two great choices are to get yourself dressed and be wearing what you want to wear, or you don't, no problem. I'll help you into the car. You can change at any point, but we are leaving at 8 o'clock. So I would say, like, in a nutshell, that is all the steps of the approach, and it requires all of these mind shifts. I'm not here to control my child. It's not my job, nor can I control my child. I need to figure out what the limit is that's going to scaffold their adaptation.
And I guess the flip side of this is we see, so many children are spending more of their waking hours now in a childcare setting. Again, whether that's Head Start, traditional childcare, whatever you want to call it, but outside of the home. And I know you work a lot with, preschool organizations and groups to try to identify and mitigate some of this behavior. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Because if they've figured this out during the day, then it seems to me there's a massive role that the parents still have to play at night when the kids come back into the home, right? And it wouldn't make sense to have all these rules and boundaries and different techniques, from 8 to 5, and then suddenly you come home at 5 o'clock and
Yeah.
it's a free for all, right? So how do you kind of work with those programs, with the confine of, again, this isn't one-on-one care. Now you're in a congregate setting here. So how do we handle one disruptive behavior in a classroom full of many? And then also kind of how do we bridge that so whatever's being taught and learned and emphasized during the day continues to be important and doesn't get undone, I guess, at night. I would think that's an interesting conversation you have to have.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and all the factors you've laid out are critically important, right? That in the ideal world, there would be a uniform approach that parents and teachers were collaborating on, right? This is a little guy. He gets triggered very quickly, let's say, when it comes to a transition or when it comes to a disappointment. And so here's the approach we're all going to take. That would be, a perfect world. I will tell you, Andy, that what is very common is kids doing really well at school where there's many more clear rules,
Hmm.
right? It's like a military operation to run a safe childcare class. And so the kids learn very quickly, that they take their plate, they put it in the garbage, then they sit on the carpet, they get a book. They're not negotiating how much time they're playing outside or what's for snack. Like they've learned it, like, because at school, the teachers are saying things like, here's our options today. There's yogurt and there's cheese sticks. And a kid says, I want pretzels. And the teacher says, I get it, but I love pretzels too. They're not an option. Well, I'm not eating it. No problem. If you change your mind, let me know. Right.
Right,
They
right.
cut, they bump up. It's the bumping up against the limit that gets them to say, fine, I'll have the cheese stick. Right. So that is, and then what happens is at home where the child feels safe to just be themselves and the rules and limits are often less clear at home, and there's more emotionality, the relationships are completely different, often then the child will, act out more. So that is a common phenomenon. And I do have an article on my website called Why Kids Are Superstars at School and Monsters at Home, like all stuff that just comes out of the mouths of parents. But, but, but the what I would suggest we do it in school is when there is a challenging behavior is the same approach to what I'm suggesting for parents, but you have to be mindful of obviously the environment, right? One child's needs can't be more important than the other 13 kids' needs. And there's all of those interactive variables when you've got a group of kids. So limit setting might have to look quite different. So for example, but let me say that the steps are still the same insofar as you have to get really clear about what you control and don't control. So let's say you have a child who goes to the magnet tile area and it's full, but they're barreling, right? They're barreling in, they're not accepting, their mind is set, they want to be there with their friends doing the magnet tiles. So what we're not going to do is go down the rabbit hole of Charlie, stop, Charlie, it's full. Charlie, come out of that. I've told you 5 times, Charlie, stop. First of all, it's very shaming. And in classrooms, when kids hear other kids' names repeatedly, they start to associate, oh, Charlie is the bad kid because they're
Mm.
constantly hearing their names. So I learned from an amazing preschool teacher years ago who made a rule in her classroom to never say a child's name more than once. If the child wasn't able to cooperate, she went to them directly. So, like, let's say that's the case. Charlie barrels into magnetiles. What I say to myself as a teacher is, I can't make Charlie agree to not go into magnetiles. That's his body. I can't mind meld with him and get him robotically to agree to go to housekeeping instead. So I would go to Charlie and say, Charlie, and I would always start with empathy. I know you really want to be in Magnetos, and it's so disappointing. I feel you. I totally get it. We always start with empathy for their desire. You're not agreeing. You're not acquiescing. You're just saying, I see you, little guy, and it's really hard when you have an idea of what you want to do and you can't. So I'm going to be a helper, and I'm going to help you choose another station. Okay. So that would be step one. So you're providing a really clear boundary. You're not relying on them agreeing to cooperate with the plan. Right. And in the ideal world, you would move them. Now, let's say Charlie just throws himself on the floor. If they're not being destructive, like less is almost always more. So now Charlie throws himself on the ground, but everyone's happily playing. He's not being destructive. He's not hurling things or hitting people. I would just say, I know, but it's tough. When you want to choose another center, let me know. That's what kids, the more you try in that red zone moment to get them to get with the program or to teach them some lesson, almost always the more escalated they get. I have this new saying, which is the limit is the lesson. You don't have to like barrage them with like, when the center's full, you can't go over to. That's what you're teaching. He's gone in, he's the fifth man, and all you're doing is saying, I know you really wanted it, but the center's full. I'm going to help you choose another center. So that's my new mantra: is the limit is the lesson. You don't, these kids are taught to death. It's like Charlie Brown's teacher. They're just completely tuning that out. Plus, they're in red zone. When kids are in red zone, they're not processing anything. So
Yeah.
then I just let Charlie, and often then Charlie will, when he realizes like we haven't abandoned Charlie, we've acknowledged his upset and we've given him space. I'm here for you. When you change your mind, let me know. But the more you barrage the child, usually the more they retreat. What I'm doing is showing a lot of empathy and then giving them space. Often at this point, Charlie gets up and he may choose another center. Let's just take it to the nth degree. Because people out there are wondering, like, well, what happens when Charlie grabs the magnet tile and starts throwing them or hitting people with it? Then remember, in my thought process is always, I can't rely on Charlie to ensure safety. He is a 3-year-old.
Right.
My job is to ensure the safety. So at that point, I would say, if you need something to throw, I'm going to help you find something safe to throw. And then I might take him over to an area where he can throw some bean bags and something. You see, it's all a teaching approach, but it all is setting clear limits that ensures that the teacher is in charge. If that doesn't work either and he's just out of his mind, then I would say we're going to go take a break. And then you would need a place in your classroom or your school that is boundaried and safe and loving. No problem. Your body's acting before your brain. I'll be a helper. That is much more loving than getting into a knockdown, drag out argument with a 3 or 4-year-old, trying to get them to get in control. It almost always has the opposite effect.
I like the red zone references, and I think about all the different trips we go on as a family, and of course the days are Claire, the days are so overprogrammed. I mean, like, but again, you're on a vacation, you spend a tremendous amount of time and money and effort to get everybody there, and of course you want to experience all you can, right? But you start to think about kind of the moments that lead up to that red zone, and of course, it's did they get enough sleep? Have they had enough to drink? Have they had enough to eat? Are they hungry? All these, and hey, look, I get hangry too. I'm the same way, but you kind of think about some of these avoidable red zone things that at least you can take some control of and say, hey, let's take a time out. Let's get a snack or, I don't know, the naps, I can't really figure those out, but naps would be nice. Um, are there other kind of warning signs before you get to red? And I guess again, it's going to be kind of child dependent, knowing what, if the child has troubles with transitions or sharing or whatever it may be. But are there other things other than kind of like the sleep and the food and all that stuff that I'm kind of overlooking, or what are some other signs or warning things that we could get to or try to hedge, I guess, before we get to that red zone?
Mhm.
Because the
Yeah,
red zone is, I mean, nobody wants to be in that red zone.
no, nobody
You
wants to be
can't
in
do
red zone.
anything.
And actually, in my work with families and in schools, this is the process we're always going through. We're trying, it, 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 there's big payoff if you can take the time to really think through, like, who is my child and what makes her tick? So, for example, I have a family with a child. She's 6 years old. She's a very big reactor, right? This is what I've been alluding to, that temperament matters a lot. You know, if you have a go with the flow dandelion, right? The kids who are like just thrive, are adaptable, nothing affects them so too deeply. They're able to kind of move through difficult situations and stay fairly regulated. Um, then there are the orchid kids, and those are the kids who, like orchids, are extremely sensitive, right? A very small event or change can catapult them into a very big reaction. A lot of that is temperament. They're not trying to work your last nerve or be a prima donna or a drama queen, or, you know, are spoiled and trying to get all the attention. They just have a much lower trigger point for discomfort. Their systems get overwhelmed much more easily. And by the way, the next book is called Big Reactors, and it's all about my work in the trenches with the kids who have this temperament trait, because it requires an incredible amount of parental self-control and mindfulness to help that child learn the emotional regulation. It's doable. And that's, you know, that's for fall 2025. But for now, I would say the reason I'm raising it is because it's often the kids who are the big reactors where it can be really helpful to anticipate what might trigger them, not to overprotect them and protect them from all triggers, but you know that if they're a kid who gets overstimulated easily, you prevention wise may want to scaffold your weekend to limit too much engagement, to build in rest times. So for example, this child, the 6 year old I was telling you about, when her grandparents come in, she loves it, but it's also stressful because it's so stimulating. There's so much excitement, things are different. And there's a lot of expectations, and she can get triggered into discomfort very easily. And then, of course, the parents are mortified, and the grandparents are, are judging, and it's a whole hot mess. So, with this family, we made a plan when the grandparents were coming for the holidays to really scaffold for success. That's what I call it. So, for example, on Sunday, rather than her going to church with the family and then do a family lunch, which was going to definitely set her off, the rest of the family went to church. Mom stayed home with her. They made a lunch together to share at home instead of going to a restaurant. And she still had love, and she was so much more regulated, had much more loving interactions with everybody, including her grandparents. So you see that you have to really know where your child's limits are. And again, we're not talking about overprotecting, like you just get to stay home and playing by yourself all day. We're figuring out what's the right expectation. If the expectation for a child is not within their reach with support, that is the space of total frustration for child and parent, right? And so, for example, you're going to Target, and this is classic, right? You're in the car and you're saying, Johnny, we're going to Target. Remember, it's just a food shopping today. We're not getting any toys. And Johnny, of course, totally sanguine, theoretically, oh, no problem, Dad. I'm all good. We're just going to get some food. Great. They get into Target. He sees, whatever, the unicorn or the Tonka truck or whatever it is, the lightsaber, and now he's flipping out, right? I need it. And the dad, this is my favorite. The dad's like, you promised, you said you weren't like, but I get it, like there is that sort of like, you're a smart kid. We have this conversation. Like I took you at your word, and now you're taking it back. And that wasn't the deal. So of course, all that signals to the child is that the dad there's a loophole because he's trying to kind of convince his child to go back and say, yes, you're right. Like, what 4-year-old is going to say, oh, good point, Dad. I did say in the car that I was fine with just getting food. Like, no. What needs to happen? That's a very triggering moment. So, one is you may decide if I'm just doing food, I'm just not going to take my child to Target because it's unnecessary. It's too provocative. Or you're going to say, I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to take him to Target and I'm going to tell him that he's going to help me find these 4 items. And you take pictures of them and you put them on a piece of paper and you make it a game and you say, we are going to go. You explain in advance what you're going to do. He goes in the store. He does see the Tonka truck. He starts to flip out. And what he needs is, I know, bud. I know you're seeing the truck and it's really, really hard. Let's go get the food. Would you like to choose the cereal match? And he's like, no, he's tossing the thing. No problem. The dad takes the paper back. He stays calm. He shops as quickly as he can. Often at some point, the child realizes dad is not going to get in the Tonka truck and then they adapt, or they just have to get in the car. And the dad said, great kid having a difficult moment. I stuck with the limit. And when you do that over time, now the next time the dad says, we're going to Target, we're only getting food, the child remembers then. And the dad might say, remember, bud, you are going to see things you like. That happens. And that may be upsetting, and that's okay. I'm not asking you to like my rule, but we are only going to get food today. And if you keep doing that over and over, you start to see adaptation. But you see with these big reactors, it just takes a heroic amount of self-control. But it will benefit you greatly if you really think in advance. Like I'm going to bring a snack for him. I'm going to bring something he can eat while we're at Target if I'm not getting sweets, right? Or I'm going to put a boundary on our pantry to avoid the fight every time they go into the pantry at will 5 minutes before dinner to get gummy bears. No, you're going to say, Bud, I know it's too tempting. I'm not blaming you. I would want to go in there. I've learned not to because I've lived decades more than you, and my parents helped me do that. So I'm going to help you by putting a lock in twice a day. I will take out the sweets and you can choose the sweet you want. Done, right? So a lot of it is preempting. And if you have the limits and boundaries in place and you're not expecting your child to like them, you hear that in a lot of my stories. I'm often saying to kids, this is the limit. I don't expect you to like it. Why would you like that? I'm not giving you another episode of Peppa Pig or Power Rangers or, Paw Patrol. Like, of course I don't, but that's our limit. And if you need to be upset about it, no problem.
Thinking about these big reactors, I wanted to loop back a little bit to the classroom scenario, and a couple things come to mind. I mean, I don't know, you know way better than me about kind of the peer to peer relationship, if any. So I guess my first question is, does it make is it like an adult where, look, there's certain things in public I'm not going to do because I don't want to look silly, I don't want to embarrass myself. There's peer pressure, all that kind of stuff. Is that coming into play at this young age? I guess is my first question. And then the second question is kind of thinking about these big reactors. And forgive me, I'm probably going to use the wrong word here, but I could see how a big reactor would disrupt a classroom. And I could see that as being a real challenge because, look, we all have ratios. And if, one of your instructors, one of your teachers is focused on one big reactor, who's watching all the other kids or something like that. So I guess I'm curious to hear kind of about that peer to peer relationship, if it exists, if it does, what that looks like, and if that can help modify some behavior. And then also thinking about the big reactors, like how do you manage that in a classroom? Because it seems like it would be really resource intensive and maybe consume a lot more of your effort and your attention than some of the other kids may be getting if you don't handle it the proper way.
Yeah, again, all good questions and tough situations, and I'll do my best to give you some sort of the foundations I think about since, these are thorny issues that often we spend a fair amount of time problem solving. I'm just saying that because I don't want to simplify it or
Right.
act like, take these 3 steps and that's not going to be a problem anymore. That's just not the way it works. But again, I would, if you're in a classroom with a kid who is triggered quickly, right, into a big reaction. Um, by the way, let me also say that these kids are amazing. Often these kids who have the bigger reactions are very sensitive, very empathetic, very passionate and compassionate, incredibly creative, thoughtful, insightful human beings. It's just that their systems aren't filtering out. It's like they don't have a protective layer to help them calm and move on in the way that like the dandelions do. So I would say that the first thing I would be doing is again reminding yourself that you these are great kids having difficult moments. I would do my best to anticipate what are some of the triggering situations for this child. So, for example, let's say transitions are hard for this child. Here's a great example of what I do all the time in classrooms. So I say to myself, the trigger is okay, the lights go on and off, or they sing the cleanup song, and we're going to be moving and we're going to be lining up to go outside. So what I do is I would suggest a teacher go to Andy and say, Andy, I need a helper. I have a really important job for you. We're going to be getting ready for cleanup, and I need you to decide which of the toys in this area you're going to be the helper with. Or I need you to come and hold the bag with all the balls for outside and be the caboose, and count all the kids in front of you. So when we get to the playground, you can tell me if all 14 of us are here. Like you basically connect and give them a positive focus of their energy to preempt that moment of like falling apart because you've made a decision that there's going to be a change and they're not ready for it. So you're kind of priming them for it, and you're giving them a really important job, that focuses their attention in a positive way. So I do a lot of that, right? Like what can we do that can preempt the meltdown or the difficulty with the transition, right? Or let's say you have a kid who his big reaction is he's very controlling and he's making this amazing block structure, but he doesn't want anybody else coming into the block area, right? So that's the thing, right? At home, it's like no problem. That kid may be able to play with his blocks all day long and he's never had to learn. But now he's got other kids, and these are the kids who often they just see a kid approaching and they're like, get away, get away. They're, defensively like, don't enter my space. So again, I think what can help in a situation like that is for the teacher to say, I know you want to be in control. This is a shared area. So I can either help you move your things here and you can play on your own. I can help you play with the other kids, right? Because of course we always want to offer that. But if that's hard, then I'm going to help you move to another center, right? Because at the end of the day, the teachers have to be in charge. They have to run a safe classroom. So again, that goes back to like we can't let this child's need to monopolize the blocks supersede the other kids' needs. So they go to preschool to learn how to share and collaborate. You can't make him play collaboratively with the other kids, but you can set the limits. Say, if you want to stay in the block area, we share, I can help you with that. If you're having a hard time with that, I'm going to help you choose another center. And then, like I said before, we can't, if you have a kid who's really explosive and then you're in a different situation where you need to meet with leadership and say, we need a plan. Like either we need to be able to have another, like in some of the schools I'm in, we call the front office where there's people who can come and even take the child for a little walk for 10 or 15 minutes, help them go to a safe space and do what they need to do with their bodies to just get back into regulation. But you have to have a plan that you control. That's the key. So sometimes you do have to broaden the people involved. And then there are going to be times where the child's not appropriate for the program. I mean, that does happen where their needs are not able to be met, even with the most amount of support. And then you have to figure out how are we going to figure out how to help this child be in the right place they're supposed to be? A smaller classroom, a school that's specifically for kids with special needs. So as you see there's so many pieces of this puzzle that, again, we could talk about at much greater length, but generally that's the approach, I would take.
And what did you think about kind of that peer-to-peer relationship or interaction? Is it because I know some classrooms will say, everyone look at Johnny. He's doing such a good, I'll call him out and kind of
Yeah.
model that behavior. I don't know what your thoughts on that
Well,
would be.
that per se, I'll just, that is interesting because that is very common. And I would say that that's shaming.
Okay.
Like any kind of comparison is shaming because you're basically saying, look, the other kid can do it and you're not. So with the kids I work with, especially, that could be a really big trigger. But I see it all the time. They're like, oh, so and so is doing this, so I'm going to call on him. And what I might do instead, just by the way, is say, I can call on you when you're crisscross applesauce. I can call on you. And then they're going to call on the child because he's crisscross applesauce. But you see, it's sort of like when parents say things like, oh, don't you want to be toilet trained like your cousin Louie? And all like you see the child completely clam up because it's just calling out that they're behind and they're not doing what the others. So there are ways to do this without shaming. But to your larger point, Andy, I think that there's so many there's so many variables when it comes to the peer-to-peer thing. Like ultimately, you are trying to get kids to engage and to learn how to read each other's cues, right? And how to respect each other's space. I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about, or maybe there's so many aspects of the peer-to-peer thing. Like, what are you specifically thinking about?
Well, I guess I'm just kind of thinking is almost like being around your peers as a modifier for some of the behavior. Like you'll
Oh,
come home
okay.
and you do something at home that you would never do in the classroom because you would
Right.
be embarrassed in front of your peers or something, I guess is what I'm trying to kind of get at.
For some kids, yes. Some kids who are very self-conscious and don't want to be called, like in a group, don't want to be called out on things or get something wrong
Hmm.
or be, made fun of, that will override whatever it is they were going to do or
Okay.
felt impelled to do that they may do at home where they don't feel that same. That definitely does happen, that there is sort of peer influence or peer pressure. But I also have a lot of kids, like for example, many parents are like, oh, they'll get potty trained at school because all the other kids are going potty. That happens for some kids, right? They don't want to be the only one who's in diapers. But then you have kids who just get overcome with shame about it
Hmm.
and they just get paralyzed. Like because they feel ashamed about it, shame is not motivating. For some kids it is, but for some kids it's overwhelming and their system kind of just shuts down. So that's where the temperament piece comes in, right? So like the kids who want to like look tough, then they're not going to show like weaknesses, right, at school in a way that at home they may be much more comfortable doing that. So that is a thing. And yeah.
Yeah, I think it's especially now with like one child being one and one almost being four. I think it's fascinating to see that kind of transition at the young age where you're kind of playing in the same room, especially like the 6 month old, 1 year old, whatever. She's playing in the same room with other kids, but doesn't really play with the other kids. You know what I mean? And then at some point, magically that switch flips, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, there's other kids here, and I can play with them." And they start interacting. I think that was one of the coolest things to see, and I'm looking forward to seeing it again. Um, but I just wasn't sure kind of how that social construct worked and if that would be any help at all to reinforce maybe good behavior because I guess you don't want to get out of line or you want to adapt to what your peers are doing or something. But it's really fascinating to see like the various stages and how they recognize and react to and respond to other people and other kids, other babies, other children. But that's always been kind of fun to reflect upon. Well, I really appreciate how generous you've been with your time and, of course, your wisdom and insights. It's amazing all the situations that you encounter. And I think it's just, you're just such a wealth of expertise. I really appreciate it. I don't think I've ever come across a story where I've said, "Hey, what about this?" and you haven't had some kind of, personal experience about it. So I know that you see quite a bit of stuff, and being able to bring that down to a level that's really impactful and really meaningful is very, very good. I appreciate all you're doing. I know that you work with not only families and parents, but you do also work with programs as well. If folks want to get engaged with you, if they have some issues, if they want to, hire you, I'm assuming you're open for that kind of consulting and stuff, right?
Yeah, and I love it. I love working in classrooms and with teachers and in programs. I love the collaboration and the mutual learning, and also the ability to kind of support a whole system. Because of course, when I'm working with, let's say, a teacher on how to manage a challenging situation with one child at a specific time, the learning then gets transferred to all the other kids they're going to see along the way, right? Who may exhibit similar behaviors. So I find it really rewarding to work with teachers, and including the one-on-one with parents. And the best way to reach me is my email. I don't know if you're going to share some stuff through this podcast, but probably if you don't memorize my email, going to Lerner Child Develop. If you just Google my name, honestly, it will come up. But my website is lernerchilddevelopment.com. It has all my contact information and hundreds of blogs that go very deep into all of these issues we've touched on, that really tell in the weed stories, not just sort of large concepts and theories, but really like what this looks like in practice.
And of course, we have the book, Why is My Child in Charge, is out now, available where books are sold. And we're looking forward to Big Reactors coming out in 2025. So that'll be good. How's it going? I know it's hard to write these books. How you doing on the book
It's it's
writing?
it's it's submitted.
Oh, okay,
So
good.
yeah, it's submitted. So, it's just a lot of, editing and covers and, figuring out some of the details, but it's out of my hands. Feels
Wow.
great.
Congratulations. That's a great one. Great. Check
Yeah,
that off the list for
I
sure.
purposefully did made gave they offered me deadlines, and I did December 1st because I did not want it to bleed into holidays.
Well, good for you. And I will put a big plug in. If you haven't subscribed to Claire's newsletter, you really need to do so. It is by far one of the most insightful and action-oriented newsletters that I receive, and one that I truly read every word of. They are lengthy, but they're worth the read because they're packed with real-life stories, real-life techniques, and examples that are really, really helpful. So thank you for putting out those. I know those probably take you a little bit of time to put those newsletters together. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you again, everybody, for being here. Thanks to Claire, a wonderful asset and a really good resource. I would encourage you to reach out to her if you're having some of these issues. She has helped literally thousands and thousands of families and programs across the country. Great resource now to have in your network. And I really appreciate everybody joining us today on Early Childhood Chats podcast. If you have suggestions, comments, guests you'd like to see, please reach out. We're always looking to provide the best content that we can, and I do hope that you found today's podcast insightful. I know I certainly did. And we'll see you next time. So for Early Childhood Chats, this is Andy saying thank you so much and have a wonderful day.